So these past few days have been depressing as fuck. I've had some serious anxiety about World War III breaking out, because ever since Fallout 4, I have little faith that new Fallout games will actually be good. If only we could go back to the days of New Vegas, which I had to stop playing repeatedly because I could only get it in German. Unironically though, if you're looking forward to the apocalypse, get help! So I decided instead to talk about something that's a little more fun and uplifting, to bring a little fun into your life and lift up your spirits. 12 years ago, in my hometown of Cologne, Germany, a film premiered which accompanied me throughout my youth. I never saw it, but it was a cultural phenomenon. I did get to see it a couple of months ago because I found the time and I wanted to, and I had stopped having forgotten about it. Fucking why do you care? You've heard of this film, it's called Borat, and it was a huge oversight of mine not to have seen it, because it's probably Sacha Baron Cohen's best work. And that's saying something, because Sacha Baron Cohen has done some great fucking work. If you don't know the plot, it's basically a fake TV presenter from Kazakhstan who travels to America with his producer to learn about American media. And then he's in his hotel room and he sees an episode of Baywatch, and then he goes on a big journey from New York to LA so he can marry Pamela Anderson. The film is needlessly, blatantly, and exceedingly offensive, which is why it is so good. Kazakhstan is portrayed as this ass-backwards shithole, which, by the way, none of the scenes in the film were actually filmed in Kazakhstan. They were actually filmed in Romania, and the people who were filmed for the film, they thought it was for a documentary, and they didn't know that they would be ridiculed in American cinemas. Because here's the thing about Borat, right? Though it had a whole lot of characters, a huge amount of characters, it only had 4 actors. You have Sacha Baron Cohen as Borat, Ken Davidian as his producer, Lunel as a prostitute of the same name, and Pamela Anderson as herself. All other scenes are just Sacha Baron Cohen as Borat rampaging through all of America with a production crew that pretended to be a lot of different things, but not the thing that it actually was. And then he fucks with people, and he films that, and he puts that in the movie. Just to give you some examples of the amazing things that happen in this film. Borat sings a fake national anthem at a rodeo. Borat runs naked with his producer through a hotel convention center while there is a convention. Borat brings a bag of his own feces to a fine dining society. And my absolute favorite, after learning to speak like you from a bunch of urban youths, this scene happens.
What's up with it, Vanilla Face? Me and my homie Azamat just parked our slab outside. We're looking for somewhere to post up our black asses for the night. So bang bang, skeet skeet, nigga.
Are you surprised that I love this film? Now, if you're like me, you're currently living in 2018. And if you're currently living in 2018, you might be asking yourself, what the fuck? How does this happen? How is this a Hollywood-produced movie, right? How are these the same companies that are today kowtowing to the PC clerics and going to great lengths to appease any tiniest bit of offense that they might take at anything that is being done in any aspect of the Hollywood culture? Borat was, at the time, a critically acclaimed piece of shockumentary, which people generally perceived as being a masterpiece of comedic genius. It was nominated for an Oscar and actually won a Golden Globe. Imagine this film coming out just 12 years later, right? Imagine the outrage, picture it, at Hollywood, a major Hollywood production, creating something this grossly offensive. What changed? It's not like the offended little snowflakes didn't exist back then, right? I mean, huge amounts of people tried to sue Sacha Baron Cohen and his production company. Advocacy groups went ballistic, as they did at everything at the time, just like they do today. Jewish groups, gypsy groups, Muslim groups, feminist groups, conservative Christian groups, the government of Kazakhstan. Kid Rock actually divorced Pamela Anderson over this film. Powerful people tried to block this movie. They tried to censor it. They tried to make sure that it wasn't shown in cinemas. They try to ban the advertising. Anything that you can imagine them doing today, they were doing back then. But still, the film became a huge commercial and cultural success because other powerful people held against that censorship. It's freedom of the arts. Being offensive and pushing boundaries back then would earn you praise and adoration. Expanding the Overton window, keeping it as wide open as it can possibly be, was seen as the good thing that it fundamentally is. What happened that made it so Borat could not be produced today, in a world that should have become more liberal, open, and progressive? Why are the very same people that praised Borat back in the day now shitting on pieces that are much less offensive because they are offensive? Well, I'm sorry to say this, but the moral Puritans and the perpetually offended, they won. And they didn't do it by changing the minds of the public, they did it by infiltrating the minds of the seats of power. Because those are the institutions, and the institutions are the only thing you need to control. They have successfully created a phantasm within the bubble of the rich Hollywood and entertainment sphere, which they now present to these rich producers, and it proves that the public does not like films like Borat, even though that is entirely untrue. But because they control the culture in those areas, that culture is trickling down to the rest of the world, even if it is not entirely congruent with it. And they do this solely so they can push their own political agendas. Hold on, I have to take this. Yeah?
Yeah, you do realize that talking about the death of comedy isn't funny or uplifting, right?
No, you. Interestingly enough, Kazakhstan and its government, the people and the government both, they actually backpedaled and ended up loving Borat because a lot of people went there because they saw the film and they found that it was completely unlike what they had seen in the film, but it was actually pretty dope. Let's be honest here for a moment, right? This is kind of cool. Borat is not alone in this. All of you can probably list several things that are entertainment and cultural items from the last 30 years where just the air of a culture in which the arts were allowed to do whatever they pleased just sticks to them. And you know that that was the case back then because of just how many things these artworks were capable of doing. Shadowrun has some pretty woke lore written in the 90s, I think. There was this great jihad where the Muslims conquered Spain, you know, like in history. And then the Spaniards conquered them right back and did a whole bunch of pogroms on them. You know, also like history. You couldn't do that shit even in fiction today. Muslims as the aggressors and then Muslims dying? Oof! Not to mention that like 90% of Shadowrun lore would be considered more cultural appropriation if introduced it to today's tabletop scene. The only reason it is allowed to exist is because it's old. Imagine the Bloodhound Gang, one of my absolute favorite musical groups, right? Some of their songs are being retroactively erased from reality because they were so willfully offensive. And to be honest, my dudes, it doesn't look very good for the future. There's this thing called Strauss-Hower generational theory, which may give us some insight as to what we could expect to happen in the near future. Just as a disclaimer, of course, as any theory dealing with a system as enormous and complex as human society, Strauss-Hower is unfalsifiable, and though it is supported by a strong body of evidence, there is a lot of critics leveling some very valid criticism against it. It's an interesting theory nonetheless. It's for your consideration, not for your canonization as gospel. Basically, the theory posits that society goes through a cycle which has 4 distinct phases called turnings, and each of these turnings produces a different generational archetype which then influences the next turning. The first turning is a high. This is a period in which institutions are powerful and people have great trust in them, right? This is often considered a golden age of society when looked back on by the history books. Conformity to what is considered good and proper is high, and the community spirit is strong. Outsiders to this are often ostracized in horrible ways. The last high in America was from the mid-40s to the early 60s, when the nation had just asserted itself as the global superpower, and its citizens were proud to call themselves American. The second turning is the awakening, in which a new generation attacks the old institutions in what essentially boils down to individualism over conformity. While the old people are still about conformity and fitting in properly, the young people seek the soul in the rigid structure of society, and a fight about the cultural norms ensues. The last time this happened in America was the hippie generation, which rejected the highly conservative social statutes of the Golden Age and introduced new ideas. They opened the door with free love and all that shit. You had George Carlin, for instance, in the middle of this period, getting arrested for his 7 dirty words routine.
Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits.
The third turning is the unraveling, in which institutions are weak and defeated, and society enjoys and revels in its newfound freedom. Spurred on by the people who were instrumental to the initial awakening, ever stranger ideas are explored in the public sphere, and societal norms and values deteriorate or become a lot more flexible. This leads to a huge age of cultural goods and eventual, what many would consider to be, degeneracy. This started in the 80s and persisted to the mid-2000s, where all these beautiful liberal cultural goods come from. Then comes the fourth turning, the crisis, in which shit hits the fan, and old institutions are replaced with new ones by necessity, or they adapt and change. It's a time of great trouble and turmoil, where the world may seem on the brink of annihilation, and all may appear lost. This is where we are largely in the West. Wealth inequality is at an all-time high, reaching a breaking point. People feel like they have absolutely no perspectives in life. There are violence crises, opioid crises, immigration crises, all of it. Last time this happened was World War II, which leads me to the exact thing I didn't want to talk about, which is Syria and the shit that might escalate from there. Fuck! So the next stop, naturally, will be a high, which is not a good thing. I would like to remind you, because high is not a valuing term, high is a descriptive term indicating high institutional power and high social conformity. Technically speaking, the Third Reich was a high. It followed the awakening that was the end of the Second Reich, the unraveling that was the roaring and degenerate 20s, especially in Berlin, and the crisis that was the depression that came over from the United States, which also the Great Depression led to the American superpower high. So you see how that works. Of course, the whole cycle was very quick in Germany at the time, but these cycles they're not always exactly 20 years. They average at about 20 years. Sometimes they're longer, sometimes they're shorter. Offensive comedy and counterculture have their golden ages in unravelings, not in highs, because unravelings are the opposites of highs. Depending on who wins the culture war at the end of this crisis, anyone who likes offensive comedy and who likes to push boundaries, we might have a problem on our hands. Because the institutions are already overrun with SJWs, and the institutions are the exact thing that becomes powerful during a high, and they are the exact things which dictates the societal consensus during a high. So if you're not part of that mainstream SJW culture in the high that will probably come over the course of the next 10 years, you might be fucked. Because the kinds of things people in a high do to outsiders of the mainstream culture ranges from segregation to genocide. And with information technology being the way it is, I do fear for the future. This is why it's so important that we win the culture war, as it's called, which I find is a completely legitimate name for it, because it is a culture war at the end of the day. We should lose our fatalist attitudes, because yeah, sure, right? It is always darkest before the dawn. But the new day may still have it out for you. Of course, we can't say any of this for sure. We find ourselves in an age where cross-cultural communication is at an all-time high. It is massive. It has never been like this before. And we are communicating freely with other cultures, average people in other cultures, which are at entirely different turnings on the cycle of culture. Japan is experiencing an unraveling, and has for quite some time, as is visible through all the frankly degenerate and really fucked up things that come out of Japan. And the big crisis is already on the horizon. An awakening is budding in Saudi Arabia and Iran, where the high, which is the conservative Islamic norms, are being questioned by the younger generation. Also to consider are robots, the free availability of information technology, and the possibility of actually building a type of network that cannot be controlled by powerful people, where free exchange of information will always be possible. Then you have the whole immortality thing, which might be achieved in the next 50 years, and that will be a whole different game changer, because it changes the power of the generations, because old generations no longer die, they just stay. As we colonize space, there will be massive cultural drift, incredible cultural drift, and really, how unified is a culture anyway, in which every fucking Discord server has its own in-jokes and its own memes? Which, you know, join my Discord server. Our subculture is a lot less shitty than the subculture of Dankula's Discord server. At the end of the day, we are still getting offensive comedy, even as we approach this new high. We're getting it over the internet, where you can see types of offensive comedy that wouldn't have even been able to fly during the last unraveling. I have no idea what the future holds, but I do know that it'll be very interesting to watch. In that spirit, I do wish you the very best at whatever you're doing in life, whatever you're doing in the day, whatever you're doing right now. And see you around, cunts!